Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well. And I am here with Mark Grondin, aka Spectrum Pulse, fellow music YouTube critic and reviewer. And we are getting together here to do one more starter pack in our series on this channel talking about contemporary country music. As you guys know, if you follow me for a while, there are a number of classic country records and country artists that I have recommended over the years, but I haven't and continue not to because I just fail at life. Talking about a lot of newer, more contemporary country. However, that is kind of Mark's bread and butter. Mm-hmm. And I've brought him on to recommend a few more contemporary country albums, a few more contemporary country artists. I have a few records as well that I'm going to be recommending. How you doing, dude?
I'm doing well. Just a lot of stuff on my plate right now, but I'm happy we finally get to manage to sit down and get this going.
Yeah, we've been talking about doing this for weeks now, and we're finally going to get to it. Mm-hmm. So I guess the reason we're doing this video is to, I suppose, make people a little bit more aware of what's going on currently in country music, or what has been going on over the past 20 years or so ago, because that's kind of the limitation that we've had in this video. No super old country artists, no super old country albums. Let's keep it like 15 to 20 years, very recent history, and just try to keep people's fingers on the pulse of what's going on right now, because generally there seems to be this opinion that because I don't like a lot of what's going on as far as the pop country mainstream, there's no good country going on, and that's not necessarily the case. You know, in the internet age, a lot of new and independent and interesting artists are kind of coming up and learning the ropes of distributing their music online, and as a result, a lot more alternative and a lot more artful country music is getting out there. It's kind of slipping through the cracks, which once was kind of held back from a lot of the public through the gates of the country industry, and the industry is now being leveled a little bit by the internet.
Well, the funny thing with that is, and I have to stress this, even going into some of this content with this review, there's the larger question that in comparison to a lot of other genres, specifically hip-hop, country is at least on average a decade behind. And given how scattered and also very regional a lot of country continues to be, it's very, very difficult for a lot of places that in more of the heartland of the United States that don't always have great internet access or have those larger music industry connections in order to distribute a lot of their music. So a lot of this is still very much underground. I'm not going to start with an underground thing because I kind of want to make the point, and this is something that kind of drives me a little crazy, is that there's a lot of people who like to take a look at the pop country mainstream and say it's all garbage. And yes, there is a lot of garbage. I've covered everything from Luke Bryan, Jason Aldean, Thomas Rhett, although he's gotten marginally better. Cole Swindle also gotten marginally better. But there's enough junk in the scene. Like, I would not want to suffer the new Keith Urban record on anybody.
Let's get started. The first record that we have here that is recommended by you is this Zac Brown Band album. Tell us a little bit about this record and what people can expect going into it and why it sort of is a starter pack pick for you.
Well, this is one of those cases where I picked a record that is actually notched some country hits in the mainstream back in the very early 2010s. Now, if you're familiar with the Zac Brown Band, they came out in the very late 2000s, and they primarily fostered a lot of competition. A lot of their groundswell came in the jam band scene out of Atlanta, Georgia, and a lot of the southern rock community. Think bands like Blackberry Smoke and what they're doing right now. But the Zac Brown Band, while they played in very laid-back, neo-traditional tones, they also got a lot more experimental with each of their following records. And 2012 is where things started really taking off without going completely off the rails like they did in 2015 with Jekyll and Hyde. Now, I like Uncaged a lot more than I think a lot of other critics do, specifically because it balances out those weirder subsets of experimentation and bringing in elements of hard rock, bringing in some elements of smooth jazz, bringing in some elements that are almost a little bit more R&B focused, but more in the country Muscle Shoals sound, and being able to cultivate a little bit more of that rootsy sound. And part of it is that these guys can play their asses off in terms of being able just to shred behind an acoustic guitar or a banjo, and being able to bring that while still maintaining really bright, sunny hooks, being able to actually capture a little bit of weight and nuance in their lyrics. One of their ending tracks is dedicated to a former member of the band that passed away, and actually sounds really quite impressive. It's a record that I would like to highlight, if only because it's the sort of mainstream accessible record, but it also shows a level of quality musicianship, some phenomenal vocal harmonies, that's just able to capture a little bit more soul and power and experimentation that I don't think the country music establishment always promotes in the same way. And this is right before the whole avalanche of bro country kind of overwhelmed the mainstream charts. So there still is that breath of fresh air, which I really appreciate.
Okay. All right. I feel like this next record that I brought over here, which many of you may have caught my review of, is also emblematic of kind of taking a lot of those traditional country sounds and kind of pulling it together with a blend of other genres. And that, of course, I mean, you've heard it, the new Sturgill Simpson album, Sailor's Guide to Earth.
Love that album.
Would you say generally that a lot of these newer artists, like Sturgill, like Zac Brown, and other up-and-comers that you've heard, are as eager to kind of bring other sounds into the style of music, kind of change things up and kind of define themselves and kind of pave their own way?
They kind of have to be in today's day and age. Because a lot of the national establishment has become so ossified around specific pop country trends and chasing all that. So you have the very much pronounced East Nashville, the more independent scene in that vein, or a lot of the Texas scene coming out of this. And one thing that has been huge in a lot of country right now is calling upon that more soulful Muscle Shoals brand of sound. So Sturgill really dove headfirst into that with the heavy usage of horns, the much bigger, much more ornate instrumentation that almost calls back to some of the countrypolitan sounds of the mid-70s. But also bringing upon a lot of those same soulful sounds that you see coming from artists like Anderson East and guys who are just bringing that level where it's almost exactly soulful inspired, but also calling on upon a much rootsier tradition. What I like about Sturgill is that it just gets rougher. It actually can bring a little bit more of that heft and that sheer playing and raw talent that comes with it.
Yeah, there's some pretty passionate instrumental and vocal highs over this record. Just because he puts other genres into the fold doesn't necessarily mean he's softening the country sound or softening the performance aspect of the music at all. And this album is actually an incredible transformation from him, because if we just go like backwards an album or two, he's kind of performing in this super traditionalist, very nostalgic country style that just kind of sounds like a jukebox throwback. You know what I mean?
For High Top Mountain, absolutely. I think I like metamodern sounds country music a little more than you do, if only because I like how it gets more fuzzed out and nasty, bringing in some of those elements of psychedelic country, especially as the album winds up, and actually gets more almost jam band inspired in that vein as well. But you're absolutely right there when it comes to a lot of those old neo-traditional sides and the balance of those old school influences in his content with so much of the modern sounds. That's where he's really expanded.
Yeah, well, like you were saying, some of those neo-traditional records and artists have been floating around for a while, and it seems like that's kind of been some of the more independent country artists' answer to the pop country sound for a bit. Let's just take everything that country was originally built on and let's try to keep it true to its roots. And now it sort of seems like the answer is slowly becoming, well, actually, let's try to, instead of going backwards, jump ahead of what's happening right now, and then just turn these country records into a hodgepodge in a way, not negatively, of different styles, and just kind of see how we can evolve the genre into something more futuristic, into something more ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. And from everything that I'm hearing about what Sturgill's going to be iterating in next, bringing in more synthesizers, bringing in a slightly more, I wouldn't say overly arranged sound, but still pushing out the genre, I see a lot of good things in the future, presuming he can keep his foot out of his mouth, because he kind of pushes it there sometimes.
Yeah, he is very vocal about his feelings about the industry. Though I think for a lot of people that's kind of his appeal in a way too. He is kind of in an attitude sense an outsider.
Absolutely.
And I know that you and I aren't super crazy about it. It's an okay record. Neither of us have sort of thrown it into the mix here. But in a way, I also do kind of see the new Casey Musgraves album in that light. She is bringing other genres and other more contemporary, sometimes even indie-ish sounds into her shtick, maybe to the point where it seems like she's pretty much making this album for people who don't really care for country music all that much usually, but still it is emblematic, it is indicative of this trend of let's just take what we know here and bring more contemporary sounds into it to sort of make it seem less alien to anybody who's not listening to country music typically.
Well, and that's part of the thing. I think there's a larger sense of stigma that's tied around some elements of that side of country, and that it's I think a lot of people crap on country specifically because they assume a certain audience listens to country music. And I think
Which is kind of weird, not even just for country, but, there are bands and artists all the time who you hear, it's like, oh, well, I would really like band X, Y, or Z, but their audience is fucking terrible.
Oh, yeah, totally. The fun thing, I'm happy you brought up Casey Musgraves because, if anything, the next artist on our list is one I would say is probably the perfect answer to what she put out with Golden Hour. And this is Lydia Lovelace with her album Real. Now, the key thing with Lydia Lovelace is that she started out in more the cowboy punk scene. She started off a lot more hyper-aggressive on records like The Indestructible Machine, where she's bringing a lot more noisier guitars fused with the much more rich country orchestration that came along with it, a lot of those traditional tones and compositional styles. And then she kind of mellowed out with her record in 2014, had a couple of really great cuts off that record, like Everything's Gone, one of my favorite songs of the year. But we're real, and the reason I want to talk about this one here is that it's probably the most accessible record from anybody coming outside of country coming in, because it pulls a lot more upon traditional Americana. It's pulling more on folk tones, pulling even more upon some indie rock styles in terms to some of the grooves and compositional style she brings in. It's not so much a straightforward country record, except the very pronounced twang in her voice and her storytelling instinct, which is absolutely top notch in some of these songs. But there is a track on the record called Heaven that is quite literally the sort of countrypolitan disco sort of sound that Casey Musgraves wanted to try and just didn't stick the landing as well.
All right, that's certainly a great endorsement of that record. And just to kind of reference back to a term you used earlier, because maybe a lot of people aren't familiar with it, the whole cowpunk thing.
Yeah.
Which is not as big a genre today as it was like through the 90s and the 2000s. We're talking about literally a fusion of a lot of country artists and country fans who get into the music scene kind of fusing elements of country with punk.
Yeah.
Which in a way is also inspired by the whole outlaw country scene. But still, and there are going to be some records that we're talking about coming up very soon that are going to be diving kind of directly into that. But generally, are there any other cowpunk artists or records that you'd like to reference really quickly now that we've kind of opened that floodgate?
The one that immediately comes to my mind, and she's even a little bit more straightforward country, especially off her last album, is Sarah Shook and the Disarmers. Just really phenomenal tones that came out of that. And even especially when you when it gets even heavier and you get a lot of the country artists coming out of more of a metal demographic, you're seeing a fair amount of that, especially coming out of the Canadian scene, for instance. Like I covered an artist a couple of months ago, Johnny Cash and the Celtic Outlaws, pulling on more Celtic folk and more of a more pronounced country scene there. And it's still nasty, it's heavy, but it pulls upon a lot of traditional country compositions and songwriting tropes, very much in the outlaw strain. And yeah, it's very heavy in its posturing, but it tends to fit in that vein, and it still has that sheer riffage and power. And that's often a very easy... And the funny thing that I've always noticed is that a lot of punks, a lot of diehard metal fans tend to have a lot of respect for country because you have the similar ingrained respect for the tradition, respect for the archetypal sound, and a lot of the swaggering outlaw posture is a great fit for metal.
Oh, absolutely. This next record that we're going to be talking about is one that I brought to the table and that I reviewed on the channel, and does have a bit of an outlaw angle to it. Not on every song. There are a lot of artists here and there who you wouldn't necessarily categorize them as outlaw country strictly, like Willie Nelson or Johnny Cash, but certainly a lot of them have outlaw country songs in their canon that they pull on from time to time. And it, depends on the record, like Shotgun Willie or, of course, like Live at Folsom, where a majority of both of those artists' outlaw tracks pop up. But then you also have artists like David Allan Coe, for example, who, a majority of everything you're going to hear from him has like an outlaw country kind of vibe to it.
Steve Earle, same sort of thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So this guy, again, more contemporary artist, came out with this record, Sonic Ranch, a few years ago. It's a very pristine album, great recording, good songwriting, and of course, given that it has a more outlaw edge to it, there are a lot of songs on here about just like drinking, drugging, being wild, being crazy, just being completely like unruly. Relationship tracks where I guess the hope of the relationship is portrayed as just very dismal.
Yep.
The nasty back and forths between him and his significant other, as with most outlaw country love songs. is usually very comedic. It's very dark. It's very grim. Wild sense of humor. Occasionally like some very lewd or nasty remarks in the lyrics as well. It's it's just very nasty, badass, manly, unapologetic record, and it doesn't tie up toward the end as well as I would like it to. It's not a perfect album. It wasn't one of my favorites of the year, but it certainly was a country standout for me the year that it dropped, and a pretty tasteful blend of traditional and some outlaw country elements coming together on that one.
Absolutely. And that's one I actually didn't cover on my channel, but I did actually hear it. Again, like Anthony, don't think it holds up as well. There's some of the overdone posturing. It's not quite in Wheeler Walker Jr. territory, but it actually mostly manages to rub off on me in a good way. And I think a lot of that sound translate pretty well, especially when you take a look at more of the outlaw tendencies that actually leads pretty well to the next one on my list. And this one is a band that got a lot of acclaim in the traditional and the indie country scene, but hasn't really gotten the same publicity, and that's for two reasons. The first one is primarily it's coming out of the Texas scene, and while the Texas scene's cultivated some great acts, like especially in the modern day, you're talking about like Wade Bowen put out a phenomenal record this year, same thing with Jason Eady, Courtney Patton, but that's more on the traditional side. What I want to talk about here is the new record from Cody Jinks, I'm Not the Devil. Now, the fun thing with Cody Jinks is that he actually started out as a thrash metal artist, and then he transitioned into country, so calling back to that. And while a lot of his records, they did have that more pronounced swaggering outlaw edge, as he's gotten older, as he has been able to more refine his sound, this is probably his most polished and his most accessible record to date. There are tunes on this, and as much as people crapped on him in the 90s, it almost reminds me a little bit of Garth Brooks. In terms of some of that tonal balance, in terms of some of the compositional elements that feed into his hooks. And yeah, this is probably the most nakedly traditional record that I've suggested for this list. And I will admit that it does require a little bit of time to really sink into. But at the same time, you get cuts like Vampires and No Guarantees and Give All You Can, and they just have that weight and they have that greater sense of older maturity that I really think has brought a lot of his edge and a lot of his songwriting prowess to the forefront. You saw a lot of the same thing with the Turnpike Troubadours last year with A Long Way From Your Heart. Just phenomenal record there. But I think Cody Jinks, if anything, steps up a little higher. And I honestly wish I probably gave it more acclaim, but 2016 was such a great year for country. And if you saw my Huron list, you probably know that.
Okay, then I'm going to tie it up, I think, here with the last album in our list. This is the oldest album that I've recommended in this bunch. It comes from 2006. And this is one of the earlier records from Hank Williams III. This is Straight to Hell. Now, this isn't just a pseudonym or anything like that. Hank III is literally the grandson of Hank Williams, which is pretty funny that he's recording music. And, considering all the country fans that are out there today, he's still a relative obscurity. He didn't quite see the mainstream fame that Hank did, or I guess has, over the years, and Hank Williams Jr. did. Now you have him, and it's quite literally a blend of punk and country, depending on which track you're listening to. And he's come out with records that have more of a metal vibe as well. Like, he's kind of all over the place stylistically.
Yeah.
But this record is one of his earliest, one of his best, I think one of his most evenly blended too, kind of bringing together these country elements, these punk elements, these hard rock elements. And, really for me, it's kind of the songwriting, it's the attitude, it's the I guess the wild demeanor, and it's the hilarious lyrics throughout the entire record as well that kind of ends up selling me on this very densely packed album. There are a lot of tracks on this record.
But it almost had to be. It's one of those records that's now being held up as a standard bearer within the genre, or the subgenre as it is. Going back to that album, and I'll admit I haven't revisited it in some time, but it's one of those records that so firmly defined what the cowboy country punk sound could be, and yet also made sure that there was enough depth that you could still sink into it regardless, while maintaining all that posturing. And it's a shame he hasn't been able to follow it up.
I know, it's a shame that his discography since this record has been kind of like a little shaky, very inconsistent, but the thing is, like, he's at a point where I think a lot of artists, unfortunately, when they're in a position where I mean, let's be honest. He's Hank III. He probably doesn't need to continue coming out with records if he doesn't want to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The song on here where he's singing about putting the dick in Dixie and putting the cunt in country and that sort of thing.
Yep.
You know, that song alone is like such an amazing track and such an amazing critique of just kind of pop country at the time in general. And you know, it's unfortunate that since then we haven't seen, you know, the same kind of I guess rebellious attitude kind of coming out of the underground. However, you know, again, he's Hank III. If anybody can kind of say the things he's saying on this record and get away with it,
it's him.
It's him. You know, most likely anybody who is independent and has the kind of feelings that they do, that he did going into this record, you know, would most likely be shut out right away and just like not listened to, or potentially see their career flounder and just kind of like go into the trash bin, saying a lot of the shit that he does on this album.
And the sad fact is that actually that has happened, especially when you take a look at the mainstream, what happened to Dixie Chicks in the mid 2000s, or even take a look at the one of the more sad cases is what's happened with the whole Pistol Annie situation, which is three women, Miranda Lambert, Ashley Monroe, and Angelina Presley. And Angelina Presley's making much more wild, ragged music. She put out a record, Wrangled, last year that I really loved. But the thing with that is that she is explicitly very critical of the country music establishment, and then coming to the sharp realization that she herself will never fit in that establishment. Hell, she got Yellow Wolf on a song on that record, and it actually turned out pretty decent.
All right, well, I think this is our starter pack for more contemporary country records. I want to thank Mark for coming on. Of course, you can find a link to his YouTube channel down there in the description, where you can catch tons of reviews and more, Billboard breakdowns. And what else are you doing these days? Are you developing any more new segments that people can check out on the channel?
Well, I've got my regular album reviews. I've got my movie reviews, which I've been doing pretty
that's right. You've been doing more
well.
movie reviews lately.
Yep. I've also got a couple other things. I've got my Resonator series, where I've been exploring a single genre in depth for an entire year, going over classics of that genre.
Okay.
For me right now, it's been hardcore punk from the 1980s, so that's been a blast. Okay. And I've also got my Why You Know review analogous series called The Trailing Edge, where I knock through a bunch of stuff I don't have time for full reviews.
Can't review everything. There's just too much.
I had 12 records, and one of them was 30 Seconds to Mars. I didn't even want to cover that.
Yeah, My dentists tell me that I get a cavity every single time I say that band's name, so I can't even. I have to protect the best teeth in the game. I can't cover them too much.
I feel your pain, sir.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on. You're the best, and again, we're gonna leave all those links and everything down in the description box. And thank you everyone for watching. Anthony Fantano, Spectrum Pulse, Mark Grondin, forever.